thought you knew, but maybe you didn't. What do parapsychologists study? So parapsychologists study something called psi, which is a Greek letter. It's basically the ineffable essence of what gives us psychic abilities. So the extrasensory perception encompasses all types of psychic ability, including telepathy, which is a mind-to-mind interaction. Clairvoyance is a knowing. And knowing can be just a thought that pops in your head. It can be something you hear, a voice. It means something you feel, something you taste, you smell. It involves all the senses, but it can be something that you didn't know prior to that event. Precognition. Most frequent way you get precognitive thoughts is through lucid dreaming, but you can get it very easily. Mine is I know what the dialogue is going to be before I hear it. But a lot of people, they know who's going to call before the phone rings. So that's basic precognition. Mediumship involves people speaking with or communicating with what we call discarnates. Those are people who passed on, or entities that are not visible. Psychokinesis, we've studied 2 forms of it, and I'll go into that more in depth. That's basically mind over matter. And more. So this is a picture of J.B. Rhyme, who's on the right. And he was studying with a gentleman here, I believe this is Carl Zener, who developed the Zener cards. The Zener cards have these symbols that you see on my shirt. They used to start with playing cards, but found them to be too complicated for psychic benefit. Zener cards are very simple. They start with this circle, which also denotes 1 or line. Then you can see plus, maybe line, square, and star. Each of those have a numerical value based on the number of lines involved. But some Zener cards have colors. So you can even see the color, and you would get the hit. So there are 3 different ways that you could get an impression from the Zener cards, and that's how they would give you what's called a hit or a correct answer. So clairvoyance, as I said, involves, it's called clear seeing, it's the French word for it. Then clairaudience is a form of clear hearing, clear feeling, clear smelling, clear tasting. So they have words for all of the different kinds of things. Precognition, as I said, the most common way that you have precognitive things is through dreams. It's the ability to see your future. So there was a famous paper released by Daryl Bem in 2011. Daryl Bem is one of the more famous parapsychologists we have, but his degree is in psychology. So he's using psychology to test precognition. What he did was retroactive facilitation of recall, where students were to view a certain number of nouns on a computer screen and visualize each object. Later, they were asked to remember the list of nouns in any order, and this is a classic memorization test. However, after that, the computer randomly chose 6 of those nouns and had the students type those in. Dr. Bem noted that the 6 words the student typed in were more likely to be those remembered on the test. So you can study for a test both before and after you take it. So if you look at the words after the test, it's saying that you could get them right. That was what was published in psychology journals, and then through psychology intuitively, because they don't think that psychic ability is real. So what parapsychologists realize is that time is irrelevant to psychic ability. And we talked about that in the robot viewing program earlier. But you have to be intentional about the time as well as the object or whatever you're trying to find. So the ability to see the past is retrocognition. Yeah, it's a thing. If you didn't know about it, and for today with Google, you can't really prove it very easily. But if you have a precognitive dream, it'll feel different than your typical dream. And I would recommend that you email yourself that dream. And if an event happens, you have proof of a precognitive dream. So mediumship is the ability to obtain information from those that have died, otherwise known as discarnates, or spiritual entities. And we have a couple of different kinds of mediums. We've got spiritual mediums. They were very popular in the early 20th century, and the reason that was is a lot of people died in World War I. A lot of families wanted to connect with those they lost and probably never got their remains back because they were legislators, which I'm sorry to say that. But one of the most premier psychologists of the time, William James, studied them. And with him and 3 or 4 other major scientists at the time, they created a society called Psychical Research. So here are some physical mediums. Now, physical mediums can do more than just create ectoplasm. These are pictures of what ectoplasm can look like when it's expressed from the body of a medium. But as you see below, somebody's got ectoplasm playing with an object. We actually do have a physical medium still around today by the name of Stuart Alexander, and one of the New York Times best-selling authors named Leslie Kane wrote about him. She went to his seance and saw a lot of things happening that shouldn't be able to happen, including a table that just floated around the room as if it was a balloon. They were able to touch it, push it down, and it just bounced back up as if it was filled with helium. So yeah, it still happens. So rapping is another physical event that can happen during a seance. And what they found was if I did this, it looks like that very first waveform, which is the sound comes at the beginning and then goes out. When it comes from what we call psychokinesis or a spirit rapping, it's as if the material inside explodes. So the sound just seems to come from the inside of the table and pops outward. And that's what the waveform is on the other side. So psychokinesis was once known as telekinesis. People still use telekinesis today. Macro psychokinesis has to do with the movement of large objects. We have somebody by the name of Ed Edwards, and I'll show you him in a minute, who currently comes to the Rhine and is frequently tested for macro psychokinesis. He can make objects move that are visible. There's also something called the Egley wheel, which you can get on the internet and practice your psychokinesis, and you can just make it spin. At the Rhine, we have a couple of other things. We have a circle of lights, and it just goes in a random direction, and the whole idea is to force it to go in the other direction. So we have ways of testing that. The other one is called micropsychokinesis. So if you know people who break televisions, or phones, or any other electronic object, maybe they have a skill for breaking electronics because they are psychokinetic. The opposite is true. You know, those people from IT who can come in and you've done everything. They walk in, they just, and it's fixed. They may have it too. It's a very subconscious thing. Some people may not know it. One of the other things they think is poltergeist activity is just a person under stress who has an unknown psychokinetic skill. It's frequent with young people who are undergoing a lot of hormonal changes is what they find. Now, poltergeist activity can also be dysphonic. I'm not going to say it's exclusively the best of the time. All right. That's the micropsychokinesis, the poor guy trying to fix his stuff. So the one thing we did, and I did on this stage earlier, was dice rolling. If you were to shake the dice in your hand, you could use finesse to get the result you want. That's what people do who are skilled dice rollers. So Ryan developed these interesting towers and other ways that a person could just think about the value of the 2 dice. They would go down there randomly and then land. And under those conditions, so in this case on the right, she's working with 6 dice. The whole idea is she wants as many of them to hit a certain number as possible. So maybe this person decided she wanted them to be all rolled to 5. So they would roll down how many rolled to 5. Another form of psychokinesis is what's known as Reiki. People might have had Reiki or heard of Reiki. It's basically, as you can see there, a person will either touch you in a particular location or just put their hands over you. It doesn't have to actually be in the room. You can do what's called non-local healing. It has been proven to work. Shouldn't be able to do it, but it does. Bill Bankston, who passed away in April, was doing healing methods on mice with cancerous tumors with great success. So this is Ed Edwards on the right, and you can see he has an object in front of him, and he would just put his hands on those two nodes, and in the front you see a small light. He could make that light move, and it's not connected. So those objects are not connected. On the other side, that's Ariel Farias and one of the parapsychology researchers named Stephen Brody. What Ariel can do is lay his hands on this table, and the edge nearest him will rise. And you'll see that there's little objects underneath the table that's measuring the weight of the table. What they're finding is the weight of the table decreases, but the weight of the medium increases. It's like there's a transference. And the other types of psychokinesis is somebody who could use upward. Upward is a French word for an object that appears out of thin air. So this gentleman could upward points, and that's another researcher who looks much younger in this picture because it was, I think, in the 1980s, I'm going to say. But coins would just appear. I don't know, and sometimes there was a sound. But on the right-hand side is the Daily Mirror. It's a group called the Skull Group in Britain. They would gather together, and this Daily Mirror paper from 1945, I believe, appeared in their workshop in the 1980s. In mint condition, not yellowed, which the paper of the day would have yellowed over time, and did. It was in mint condition. This is Ted Sirios. He did something called photography. Now, the funny thing about Ted Sirios is he had to be drunk. So as you can see, he was really concentrating on that photographic paper. And people said, oh, he had the image in his hand, and somehow it had the negative effect of going on the paper. That's not what happened. These are some pictures here of what he applied to the photographic. The Global Consciousness Project is what's currently going on now. There are nodes across the country and across the world, actually. They're called random number generators. And when an event happens, they look at the random number generator and see if it starts to come together as a less chaotic form of numbers, because they think people have an effect on when they think about an event, say 9/11. They're really focused on it. And so their assumption is that that will have an effect on these random number generators. So that's the explanation. I'm going to move on to something called remote viewing, which we just had at 2 o'clock. Remote viewing is basically a form of clairvoyance, but it's a process. So Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff were involved at the Stanford Research Institute using Ingo Swann and Pat Price from the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense wanted this program, which was eventually called Stargate, amongst other names, where they were going to use military people with some psychic ability to spy on the USSR at the time. And that's because it's in response to the USSR having a psychic program, which they did. In their psychic program, what we know about is one of these people was trying to cause heart attacks in enemy battles. So remote viewing now has many civilian purposes, such as determining the stock values and finding missing persons. You can find the Stargate program through the Freedom of Information Act. You can also watch a documentary about it called Third Eye Spies. So apparitions and hauntings, so we have reclassified these separately. So an apparition is basically a ghost, what we think of as a ghost that can move around. Maybe most common is crisis apparition. That's what we get at the Rhine, or people saying, this person passed, and at the same time I was across the country and they appeared to me at the foot of my bed and said goodbye. And that's when I got the phone call, Grandma just passed. So that's called a crisis apparition. Another story that I had from a convention not too long ago was a woman who was in a car accident. She went over the side of the road and down the side of the embankment. It was invisible to everybody that was driving on the road. She woke up in the hospital and said, how did you guys find me? Oh, the lady who lived up the street called 911 and said that she'd gone off the road. She said, oh, well, I need to know who that is. So they told her through dispatch who the woman was. She went to the door, knocked on it, and said, thank you for calling 911. How did you know it was on the embankment? She said, you came to my door. You knocked on my door and told me to call 911. And so I did. This is back when they had corded phones and no cell phones. She went, grabbed the phone, 911, turned it up, the lady was gone. So that's called a crisis apparition. That's the most common type. So it's not always about a dead person. Another one is haunting. So these are events that appear to be in a cycle that are non-reactive, meaning that you cannot cause a change to that haunting. It's like a videotape that's in a loop. But it's also dependent on the location. So if you go to one of those destroyers that they have in dock, and they have a haunting, you can just feel or watch it like, okay, that's just a video. They're not interacting with me, they have no idea. There's an apparition, I interact. So these are a couple of poltergeist activities, or what we call recurrent spontaneous PK or psychokinesis. This is a famous event called Enfield, which you can watch both documentary and fiction films about the Enfield event. And it involved a young girl who we think was the focus of it. But it could have also involved a response. So survival studies involve mediumship, which we talked about earlier. What they find about mediums when they study them at the Windbridge Institute is that telepathy is in a different part of the brain than when they're, say, they're in contact with the discard. So we know the brain is involved, we just don't think it's the source of it. The other is near-death experience. Near the Rhine, and actually the same building is a group called IANS, which is International Near-Death Association. They look at people who have had cardiac arrest and are brought back from clinical death, or maybe they've been put under so deeply, like frozen almost, where they can do heart surgery, they go into the tunnel or whatever, they come back and they discuss their experiences. So they maintain a database of all of these and they talk about it with people all over the world. The other is reincarnation. Reincarnation was studied by a gentleman out of, Reincarnation was studied by a gentleman out of University of Virginia. He went to India and other places in Asia in the 1960s. His name is Ian Stevenson. He went to India and Sri Lanka, and he would interview children who made claims of having memories of people they shouldn't have known. They remember events. They remember a location they'd never been to. So he would go to those locations, he would interview people, he would find things that worked together with their testimony. This is before internet. In 1961, people didn't have that. They might have newspapers, but a lot of people were illiterate. So he had about over 2,000 validated occurrences of reincarnation. And the University of Virginia Perceptual Studies still looks into it. In the United States, it was not a big thing in the 1960s, but it's more prevalent now, so we get more stories of things happening in the U.S. Once again, Leslie King wrote about a special event of a reincarnated child who thought he was a pilot from World War II. So what does parapsychology not include? We do not study cryptids. And we do not study UAPs. So what we do have that crosses over with the cryptids and aliens is that materialization or part materialization organism. Upwards of objects, remember that's when they just show up out of thin air. And psychokinesis, like wrapping, so they say where there might be activities with Sasquatch, they hear the knocking sounds. They also seem to put some weird stuff on field cameras. You know, some of these Sasquatch hunters, they put out those cameras that are normally used to see if any game come through, and they just put random pictures on them. People feel they could have a telepathic link with them, and there are also energy orbs or discarnate present with both of them. Those are how they cross over into parapsychology. So what makes psi work? We do not know. Many hypotheses are out there. What we do know is how you go about developing your psi. You have a passive side, that's telepathy, things that you need to have a quiet mind to do, clairvoyance, and so forth. You need to be in what's called a meditative state because you have a very noisy brain, and you lose the signal to all that noise. So you want to quiet the noise to hear the signal. So active side, sometimes entropy seems to help with it. With remote viewing, Ed May is looking into using dry ice at a location to see if that increases the ability of a remote viewer to see the view. Another thing we've learned runs in families. Now, whether that is genetic or it's because families are just naturally accepting, you have a psychic child, go ahead and develop it, we love you, or another family that says, don't talk about that. That may be the difference. It may be environment more than genetics. Also, people who are more outgoing and creative seem to have more side effects. That does not mean an introvert is not psychic. Just saying that's what they're doing. So is everybody psychic? Yes. I know you're going to say, what? Well, I'm talking about intuition. Everybody has the ability to get information they would normally get from normal means. Just like everybody can throw a ball. Well, most everybody can throw a ball. I'm not going to say everybody can. But not everybody can pass that football like Tom Brady. That takes practice. It takes a belief in yourself. And it's no different than psychic. The other thing we talk about, Gertrude Schnudler was looking at what's called psi missing. That's an interesting thing that I've actually noticed myself playing sight games with people. Like I did on the stage, we would use Xeno cards, we would use remote viewing, and they got such a negative score, which is below chance. Okay, chance for 25 card set of Xener is about 5 to 7 cards. That's what you would hit just through coincidence. That's what we find. If you get 0 or 1, that's because you don't believe you have psychic ability with you. So that's called the goat effect. The sheep effect is, yeah, I think I'm psychic, and so you go way above me. So either one standard deviation below or one standard deviation above the mean means you have psychic ability. It's funny that way. So a lot of the reason we have low psychic ability in this country is we reject it because we have a pantheon of physicists and chemists that say what we see, hear, and can measure is all that is real. Everything else is in your imagination. What parapsychologists find, that's not true. However, it's difficult to measure something in a laboratory all the time because it's spontaneous a lot of the time. Your grandma's not going to pass away but once. You're not going to set a laboratory up and say, okay, just in case your loved one passes away and has some sort of crisis apparition, we're going to catch it. We don't. So the spontaneity of psychic events is part of the problem. So that's why it's an issue. So why are we having a struggle with parapsychology gaining any acceptance in other types of scientific endeavor? So the Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882 in London. And then J.B. Vine had started studying botany along with his wife, but changed course and started studying parapsychology. He would do field work with the American Psychical Research in the 1920s and 1930s. He was then invited to come to Duke University and work with the psychology department, continuing his studies in the laboratory. So he's the first person to go from field work and bring it into the laboratory. He took average people and checked to see if they had psychic ability. This is why we know people have it. So in 1969, AAAS, which is the pinnacle of scientific acceptance, said parapsychology was an actual science of endeavor, and the rest of the organization said, you may say so, but we're not going to say. However, we do have several research facilities around the world, some of which are in the United States. The Windbridge Research Center is in California. They study mediumship, people who have relationships with discarnates or entities. University of Virginia and other organizations, especially in Scotland and the UK. These are the other organizations you can look into, including the New Thinking Aloud Foundation, another organization I work with. Jeffrey Nishlov has got a PhD in parapsychology. He's the only one in the United States. He's taken his knowledge and he interviews people in psychical abilities as well as Eastern philosophies to try and find information that will help people who have anomalous experiences. So that's my presentation, and welcome anybody to ask me any questions. Do you have any? Anybody have any interesting, unique experiences they want to share? Yes, sir.
What about your dreams? And you dream certain things, and they come to effect.
So that's called a precognitive lucid dreaming. The most common way you're getting information that may happen a few days or a few years later. So they say that when you have these, keep a journal, but don't just write it in. They say in order to timestamp these events, you want to send an email to yourself. Okay? This timestamps in the computer, which is, there's no way for you to fiddle with it, that you had these events. They say put as much detail in as possible. The reason why is that you may misremember it. When it finally happens, the memory you have will switch to what happened. Okay? So let's just say there is an ice cream truck and it has an accident with a blue car of a certain make. And then you dream this, and a few weeks later, there's an Amazon truck and it has an accident with a red car. Well, you got the truck right, you got the car right, maybe you got the intersection right, maybe you got the day right, but you got the wrong truck and the wrong car. There's still some significant hits there. So that's still worthwhile. And you take that email that you wrote to yourself, you send another email to yourself with the experience you had. And what that does is it tells you the difference between a regular, everyday dream and the lucid precognitive dream. And you know the difference as soon as you have that dream. You write this stuff down. One of the events that happened was the Lockerbie, Scotland plane crash. There was a psychic who was trying to warn the authorities. Here's the problem. What day, what flight number, what make of the airplane? He said, dude, I'm inside the airplane and it's crashing. I don't know this information. So that's the problem. It's not really giving the authorities the information to act on it, even if they wanted to. So you can go back and say, okay, I need more information about this. Thank you for that information, but I want to be outside the airplane next time I dream it, and I want to get the tail number. I want to get the airplane, whether it's TWA or Spirit Airlines, whatever. I want to know the make of the airplane. I want to know when it's flying. And you may get it. So just because you didn't get it the first time, you can keep trying. And there have been psychics that keep trying to get the information to provide to authorities beforehand. So, well, yes, ma'am. Okay. If you can get the specific information to them and say, yeah, we'll act on it. So hopefully they are. The other issue is, let's just say, oh, I had a precognitive dream about somebody being murdered. You bring some detail into that, then you're assessing, right? So there's some issue with this, but why should I have these precognitive events if they're not going to benefit people? So it's a good question. Precognitive dreams can potentially provide some benefit if before you go to bed you write down what you want out of your dream. So every psychic thing is setting your mind into a meditative state, and the other one is setting your mind to an intention. What's your question?
So accuracy, when it comes to, can we become more accurate?
So what they think happens is we're coming at a probabilistic quantum field. So you know quantum fields are probabilistic. We found that out with the slit experiment back in the early 1920s. So anything can change that. You can get closer to the event, as I said, and some of them can be insanely accurate. There's the Aberfan event where people had put some waste material from mining up on a hill, and it just grew to the point where it was landslide. Now before that event, just a few days, a child says, I'm going to die in the school. I mean, just simple as that. And then that event happened where that sludge went and covered the town, covered the school, and many children died out of it, including that child. So it can be enough. Did it get her out of the school? It did not. So some people think, and the mediums have said this when they connected with discarnates, that maybe you can't change the event, but you can be prepared for it. So maybe it's a preparation like, okay, I've come to grips with this is going to be my event. I can handle it then. So that might be why we have them and not be able to affect a change. However, some subconscious precognitive effects have led people not to take the train on the day the train crashed. So you can potentially say, well, if I listen to my intuition and I'm getting a strong feeling I should take a right turn to go to work today, and you find out later that there was an accident on the other side that had a fatality, you say, well, I might have been involved in that, and my intuition was telling me to go another direction. So it's not always a terrible outcome. I don't want you to think that. But going into your intuition and really listening to that, it can help you make some important decisions in your life if you're not really sure. So I do recommend that you give it a try. It's fun, and it can be helpful. Especially meditation can help you calm down. It can help you with your health. So that's why we think this is so important. And thank you for coming today.